Glad to be here this morning. I want to talk to you a little bit about a couple of things, initiatives going on with the department, but obviously towards the end, look forward to any questions you may have for me. So as you heard from Matt, our vision for Florida's transportation system is really still focused on our mission, right? And our mission here has been and will continue to be efficiently and effectively moving people and goods throughout the state. And how do we do that? We're really focused on these 4 core principles, and there are improving safety, enhancing mobility, inspiring innovation. And those 3 are outward facing, really working with our partners in each and every one of those 3. And then the 4th one is more of an inward facing, and it's fostering talent. How can we as an agency continue to look at recruiting and retaining the best talent that we could have within the Department of Transportation? Each and every one of us as transportation professionals, and I know those of you here on this call or in this virtual meeting know that it's very important that we continue to focus on each one of these aspects of safety, mobility, and innovation. Next slide. One of the things that drives us and how we continue to try to do each one of those aspects is what's in our budget. This is a snapshot of the approved fiscal year 2020-2021 budget. I will caveat to say that this was developed prior to the pandemic during the legislative session that occurred earlier this year from January to March. And as you can see, as the governor signed the budget into law in June, we had anticipated having for this fiscal year, a $10.3 billion budget, of which the lion's share, as you can see, is the work program of over $9 billion. And this pie chart here is just to show you how that divides up into the different programs, whether it be capacity improvements, intermodal connectivity, maintenance, and even product support. Next slide. But clearly, we've had impacts based on COVID-19. And they've impacted our primary revenue stream, which is the gas tax. Many of you are very familiar that for most of our programming and funding, it comes from the gas tax, which is basically, pennies to the gallon, right? It's all consumption based, and it's been that way for decades. And so in April and May specifically, when we had lower traffic volumes, people weren't going to get gas. There wasn't anybody pumping gas, and so therefore we weren't receiving the revenues that we anticipated. In August last month, the Revenue Estimating Committee met here in Tallahassee, and that's made up of a group of economists that represent both the legislature and the governor's office for transportation to look at what are those forecasts for our funding sources in the current year as well as in the future. This chart here is a sample of what they have forecasted for us in the coming 5-year work program. And if you notice, starting with the current year and through fiscal year 25, we plan to collect we plan to receive less than 1.3 billion than what we originally forecasted. So what we originally forecasted and what you saw in the earlier slide is our budget. We're actually going to receive a lot less than that in revenue. So we've got to balance our program to really what is forecasted as available resources. I want to note that the last fiscal year 20, that ended in June, as you can see here, we collected $198 million less than what we had budgeted and actually programmed. We were very fortunate that we took a very proactive stance very early on during the pandemic, so that last quarter of the fiscal year, we were basically able to self-solve that deficit of $198 million. So it really didn't impact any of our work program and significantly impacted our budget. But for this fiscal year that we're in, fiscal year 21, you see there 431 million is the anticipated shortfall in revenues. Clearly, we can't self-solve that. So in the coming days, we're going to be working on a lot of different aspects and weeks actually and seeing how we can balance two available resources. Next slide. But during the pandemic, we were able to accelerate a lot of construction that was going already on throughout the state, taking advantage of lower traffic volumes on a lot of our facilities so that we could do longer lane closures, additional lane closures, or move nighttime operations to daytime operations, which tends to, as many of you know, give us stronger and better productivity rates. And so over 45, close to 50 projects were accelerated during this period and saved us over 600 work days just by doing that effort. So it was a major undertaking by a lot of our partners, and we were very glad to be able to get that work done in a quicker time frame so that when traffic comes back, especially to some of these communities, a lot of that work was taken care of before they got back. Next slide. I know many of you have been following the multi-use corridors of regional economic significance, or MCORs. This was a legislative created initiative last year that gave the Department of Transportation the requirement to develop and look at expanding transportation system and also the infrastructure in the state through the implementation of 3 corridors. One of them being the South Central Corridor that goes from Collier County to Polk County. The other one is the Suncoast Corridor that extends the Suncoast Parkway from Citrus County all the way up to Jefferson County here and just east of us here towards I-10. And then the third corridor is extending Florida's Turnpike from its current terminus at Wildwood to hook up with the Suncoast somewhere along its corridor. So the 3 task forces were created by the legislation, and I appointed the task force members last August of 2019. And so for the last year, they have been meeting to develop for us the overarching needs statement, as well as guiding principles and key other issues for consideration as they prepare a report that is scheduled to be delivered to the governor and the legislative leadership by November 15th of this year. Actually, the MCOR's task forces are meeting this week to help develop those final items for the report. And although we had a little bit of a pause that occurred at the beginning of the pandemic, we were quick to re-engage the task force as well as the public, at least in June, July, August, and now in September. And we've done it through a lot of different means. We're still doing it through a virtual means, but also in a hybrid sense where we're also providing actually physical locations for the public to show up at if they want to engage using that method. So those meetings have gone quite well. Actually, we're getting a lot more public input than we would normally have gotten if we had followed the traditional ways of delivering these type programs. And so as you can see here, November 15th is when the task force reports are due. We are continuing to develop concurrently the different corridors to reach their different milestones. And just as a reminder, the legislation requires us that if we were successful to achieving those milestones, that we would begin construction on these corridors by the end of calendar year 2022, and with the anticipation of having the corridors open to traffic by 2030. So a lot more to come on the multi-use corridors of regional economic significance. And just a reminder, it is multi-use, so it is multiple infrastructure that we're looking at as part of this analysis. Next slide. So with that, I will open it up, Matt, to any questions that your members or those that are attending may have. We've got quite a few people on the webinar.
Sure. So if anybody has any questions about how to submit your questions, it's on the screen there. It's on the right-hand side of the screen. You can click on the question tab and fill them out. While we're looking for any of those to come in, I guess the question that I would kind of kick things off with is, how much have we seen an impact with regards? I know at one time we were saying 1,000 people a day were coming into the state, moving to Florida. Have we seen a significant change in that one way or another as a result of COVID, or?
No, I think you've seen some of the later numbers, Matt. The building industry, the housing industry can tell you nothing has stopped. Those in the real estate market are saying houses are being sold and bought just as frequent as it was pre-pandemic. So that, the 900 to 1,000 people a day number is still very valid. There's still people moving into the state. I think what you're seeing is a pause that still impacts our transportation system is obviously the tourism component, right? Last year, for example, was over 125 million tourists visit the state. They all use transportation to get around. Clearly, starting in March till now, it's dropped off quite a bit. So that's why you'll see in certain parts of the state, let's say Orlando, for example, you'll see a little less traffic. I'm sure you've seen it, Matt, if you head down towards the tourism area, a lot less traffic in some of those highways than normally you would see, just because that traffic hasn't come back yet. Will it come back? Absolutely. It's just a matter of time. And so then you'll still have those pressing needs of how do we move people and goods within a given region.
Okay. Our first question in is, what are your thoughts on PPPs moving forward? More or less, especially with some of the potential future budget shortfalls?
So public-private partnerships will always play a big part of how we deliver our program. The key component here, though, is although the private sector helps us by, in many cases, providing the finance up front to get a project done now, we still have to have the ability to pay them back later. And that will always be the issue, is where are the revenues that I will have to be able to provide that resource and that payback. So each one of the projects we'll evaluate, we'll look at what are those different options, including public-private partnerships.
Okay. The next question was, why is the COVID budget impact so huge for 21-22?
So it's because they forecasted the current year, just that tourism. I believe the forecast that the economists use for us in the transportation has a component of it that looks at the tourism factor. How many people, driving into the state? The 125 million, for example, last year, the rule of thumb has been that half of it comes by plane and half of it comes by car. Well, clearly the car traffic is not coming into the state, right, as much. So I believe the forecasters were looking at that component to say that in the shorter term, you're going to see that huge impact in revenues, because we're just not going to realize that. Remember, as part of those numbers, there's different components. The gas tax is by far the largest. The other ones that we do get from other sources, for example, is tag and title fees. Remember, there was a executive order that delayed or allowed you to renew later those tag and title. Now we'll get that money because people are still going to do it. It's just not going to happen in the normal process, right? We'll get it a little bit later. Rental car surcharge. There's no people coming in, so there's no rental cars, right? So all those different components are what shows you that larger hit in that earlier year. I do want to let you know, though, that I gave you a snapshot till 25, fiscal year 25. The conference looked way out into 29, and they still did not forecast us to catch back up again. What we're hoping, though, is that the economy will rebound quicker, so we'll see a steeper curve or a steeper incline, so that way we start getting back a little bit earlier. But until then, we've got a balance to those numbers that you saw there.
So based on that thought, do we see any kind of evolving situations, how we look at it on the short term, mainly if we have less cars on the road during this time, yet we still need to get products and goods to people, for especially that last mile delivery? Are we going to see a change in what our plan is for development over the couple of years, or is it more long-term approach where we know we're going to get through this. It's just a matter of getting through it, and that's how we'll develop our plan going forward.
So I think it's a little bit of both, Matt. I think one of the things I've told our team, we're going to see some changes in how businesses operate, right?
Mhm.
I think the temporary telework that has occurred through a lot of organizations are going to become more permanent for some people. Look at Google, for example, right? They've told their staff that continue to telework till next July. And then I got to believe when July comes, they're going to tell a certain group, you can continue to telework forever. So what
Right.
does that mean, right? So people coming into the Google campus, a lot less traffic than they normally would see. Well, we're going to see the same phenomenon, especially in our urban areas.
Mhm.
And I've already asked our districts to start looking at some of those projects that we have programmed. Do we need to defer those a little bit because the traffic may not be realizing it at this point because it's going to stretch out? Or are some of these changes going to occur that's going to create us to, or have us change how we really deliver the project? Is it really needed? Does that intersection improvement really need to get done now because of the changing dynamic?
Sure.
All those things will be playing a part of that. But at the end of the day, Matt, our hierarchy of how we fund projects starts off with safety,
Mhm.
then preservation, then capacity, right? So when we start to have reduced revenues, I start from that bottom, which is the capacity, and take it from there before I even start thinking about preservation and safety. So I'm still going to do the resurfacing. I'm still going to do those rehabilitation type projects, whether it be bridge reconstruction, bridge replacements, because all those are preservation.
Got it. The next question was, how does the FDOT look at longevity regarding pavement choice decisions?
So it's been a little while since, Matt, you know this, I've been involved with this, but I still think we do our life cycle analysis, right? That should be what we'd be doing.
Mhm.
And I know Tim's going to be coming up following, and I'm sure he'll add on to this, but we still do our life cycle analysis to determine what's the right solution for these locations. And in a lot of cases, it is, concrete, use of concrete is the right solution for this location. And a lot of different variables play into that.
Sure.
I mean, we're all very well aware that to substitute concrete pavement for an asphalt pavement, you have a little bit more increase on the front end, but over time, right, does it pay for itself, right? That whole life cycle analysis. Depending on where the corridor is, for example, if it's a heavy urban corridor where you really want to come in, get it done, and then don't need to see it again for 40 years, then you make that right decision, right? Versus the intermediate resurfacings along the way. All those should be part of those different analysis data points that the team should be looking at when we look at each one of those different facilities.
Okay. The next question is actually quite specific. Does the Waywood project include bridges with the corridor is what the reference is?
Oh, the MCORs, is that what the question is? Waywood?
I think that's what they're referencing.
Yeah, if it's MCORs, clearly it does. I mean, it's part of the analysis is, I mean, I try to share this with our team here. The legislation asked us to develop basically 340 miles of new corridors. We have not done that since the interstate system back in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. So that's a major undertaking. And as part of the development of the corridors, we're looking at a look at different compositions, which includes new alignment as well as upgrading existing alignments of some of the existing highways. All of them have a bridge component to it, whether it be overpasses, new bridges over existing waterways. All those will be part of those different corridors, definitely.
Okay. I'm going to give you two more because I also see that we're coming up on your 30 minutes and I want to keep you on schedule.
Sure.
How do improvements to the public rail transportation expansion, i.e. Brightline from Miami to Orlando and eventually to Tampa, impact the FDOT revenue?
So as it relates to the gas tax, it doesn't necessarily directly impact that. I mean, clearly you're going to have some divergence of people who would take the car to go from those different segments, right? Miami to Orlando, Orlando to Tampa, who may now jump on the train. But there's a positive benefit, right? Those that divert will help perhaps release some of the congestion on the highway segment that maybe then I could defer some of those improvements to a later year. I don't need to do it as soon. So yeah, I'll see less revenue, but then I don't need to spend as much either, right? So there's kind of an offsetting component. The only time that it really comes into play is when those corridors are directly next to or compete with a toll facility, where the toll facility has generated revenue, is generating revenues and has sold bonds and has told those bondholders that I will pay you back with the revenues I collect in this different segment. When you introduce now another transportation element that could compete with those revenues, you may come a little bit in conflict with those bondholders. And so in many cases, what Brightline is required to do is to do an independent analysis of what those impacts are to those corridors, so that way they can be documented. And so I know, for example, from the West Palm to Orlando route, where they're parallel to the State Road 528 corridor, they had to do that type of analysis. And so when we start to have those discussions, as we are with them on Orlando to Tampa, that same discussion is occurring.
Okay. Last question I'll hit you with, and it's a great one. As you know, we have a good amount of attendees for this conference, and a bunch of them are also students and academia. And so this one comes from a student. It says, is there a way for college students to get involved and learn more with regards to DOT and what you guys are doing?
Absolutely, Matt. I love that question. One of the things that so you heard me talk about fostering talent, right? So that group, because we have 4 groups actually that each work in each one of those items. That group is looking about, I talked about recruiting and retaining, right? So part of the recruiting element is how do we do more outward reach out to our universities here in the state and in the region for that matter, and show what the opportunities are, not only with the department, but clearly with our industry partners as well. As all of you know, we deliver our program based upon partnerships, whether it be the construction industry, the engineering industry, the maintenance industry. All of them have an opportunity, and so we're doing a lot more outreach, or will be doing a lot more outreach to our universities, and look forward to having those discussions with our students.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate your time very much. If any of the questions that I got here, if we didn't get them answered, rest assured we will make sure to get those answers for you and forward them along. Secretary, we very much appreciate you taking time to spend with us today.
Glad to be here, Matt. Have a great conference. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.